If you came here to find out what the Sumerian tablets actually say about the Anunnaki, about the making of humanity, about the possibility that human beings were created through some deliberate act of design for the purpose of labor, then this is where the investigation begins. Not with rumor, not with modern retellings, not with the easy sensationalism that usually gathers around this subject. It begins with the tablets themselves, with the words impressed into clay, with what those words claim, and with the unsettling precision of how they claim it. In a climate-controlled vault beneath the British Museum in London, preserved in archival housing and identified by the catalog number BM78941, there rests a clay tablet that creates a problem for conventional history. It is not dramatic to look at. Not really. It is reddish-brown, baked clay, roughly the size of a paperback book, covered in the familiar wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. Its lower left corner is missing. Parts of its surface have been worn away. Ancient fingers pressed those marks into wet clay more than 3,000 years ago, and time has done what time always does. It has damaged the object. It has not silenced it. Because what troubles scholars is not the tablet's appearance. It is what the tablet says. BM78941 preserves part of the Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian text describing how the Anunnaki created human beings to perform labor that the gods themselves no longer wished to do. And that statement alone is strange enough. But the strangeness deepens when you sit with the language. The text does not read like a soaring myth told only for beauty. It does not unfold like pure allegory. It presents a crisis. It presents a counsel. It presents a decision. It presents materials, a method, and an outcome. It names participants. It describes sequence. It reads less like poetry and more like procedure. The story begins with work, heavy work, endless work. Endless. The lesser gods, the Igigi, have spent 40 years digging canals, dredging rivers, carrying earth, and laboring under the burden assigned to them. Then they refuse. They rebel. They burn their tools. They gather at night. They march to the gate of Enlil. The senior gods are forced to respond. A labor crisis has emerged, and the question before them is not philosophical. It is practical. If the Igigi will not continue, who will do the work? What follows is the part that refuses to sit quietly inside the word myth. The solution proposed is the creation of a new being, a being made to bear the load, a being made to dig, to carry, to build, to labor. The method, the text says, involved the essence of a god described as blood and flesh mixed with clay from the earth. The mother goddess Nintu would shape the mixture. 7 males and 7 females would be produced, and these beings would assume the burden the gods no longer wished to carry. Pause there for a moment, because that is the point where the language becomes difficult to dismiss. Not because it proves anything, it does not, but because it does not sound like the language of abstraction. It sounds procedural, and that matters because the civilization that produced these texts was a civilization of records. The Sumerians and their successors documented everything: grain receipts, livestock, counts, legal contracts, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, labor allocations, temple inventories. They were accountants of reality. they measured, they specified, they recorded. So, when this same civilization describes the creation of human beings in a tone not entirely unlike the tone used for brewing beer, compounding medicine, or organizing labor, questions begin to gather. Questions mainstream scholarship answers by classifying the text as religious mythology. That is the standard view, and it is not a foolish one. Humanity made from clay can be read symbolically. Divine blood can be read as sacred essence. Labor can be read as a theological explanation for the hardships of life and the structure of society. This interpretation is coherent. It is reasonable. It is safe. But it does not explain everything. It does not fully explain why the process is described with such consistent procedural detail across multiple texts and centuries. It does not explain why failed or defective creations appear in related accounts before a successful human model is achieved. It does not explain why the purpose of humanity is stated so bluntly: not worship, not companionship, not cosmic harmony, but labor, digging, carrying, building, mining, work, physical work, necessary work. The sort of work a civilization is built on and the sort of work someone might want done by others. And perhaps most importantly, it does not explain why this narrative emerges from the world's oldest civilization, a civilization that appears in southern Mesopotamia, with writing, mathematics, law, astronomy, medicine, and monumental architecture already astonishingly developed. What if the issue is not translation, but interpretation? What if the cuneiform has been read correctly, but understood too narrowly? What if the Sumerians were not inventing mythology to explain the world, but preserving memory as they understood it? What if beneath the theological language there is a record of something they believed actually happened? That possibility sounds impossible. It sounds like science fiction intruding into ancient history. It challenges everything we think we know about human origins and development. It suggests intervention design, deliberate engineering. And yet the tablets exist. The texts say what they say. The procedural structure remains. The consistency remains. The question remains. This is not an argument for certainty. It is not an argument that the case has been proved. It is an investigation into what the tablets preserve, what they claim, and why they claim it in the way they do. Somewhere between mythology and memory, between symbol and sequence, between poetry and procedure, a question continues to wait. And once that question appears, it is not easy to send it away. What if the Sumerians meant exactly what they wrote? And if that question begins here on a damaged clay tablet in the British Museum, it does not end there. It leads backward into the beginning of civilization itself, into southern Mesopotamia, into the strange and abrupt emergence of Sumer, where the next part of this investigation has to go. Before there were empires in the way we now imagine them, before there were classical worlds and recorded philosophies and imperial chronicles carved into stone, there was the land between the rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates flowed through a region later called Mesopotamia, and in that region, by archaeological consensus, civilization first took shape. This is not romantic language. It is not exaggeration. It is simply where the record leads. Cities writing codified law, standing institutions, large-scale administration, complex mathematics, organized religion, bureaucratic government, all of it appears here first in recognizable form. And yet even that familiar statement may conceal something stranger. Because to say civilization began here suggests a gradual beginning, a slow rise, a predictable unfolding. But the Sumerians do not entirely look like a people slowly becoming civilized. They look, at least in part, like a people arriving with civilization already assembled. The archaeological record before them shows Neolithic villages, mud brick houses, domesticated animals, agriculture, pottery, irrigation developing over time. This is the Ubaid world stretching back into the 7th and 6th millennia BC. It is not empty. It is not primitive in the crude sense. It is a long human preparation. But then, around the late 4th millennium BC, the pace changes. Something intensifies. Something concentrates. Uruk becomes not merely a settlement, but a city. Monumental architecture appears. Administrative systems appear. Writing appears. Not in an endlessly slow crawl from nothing to complexity, but in a form that already seems unexpectedly complete. Cuneiform is one of the clearest examples. The earliest tablets from Uruk do not look like the first uncertain scratches of a newly invented system struggling toward expression. They already record quantities, commodities, names, relationships, transactions. Within a relatively short span, the script is capable not only of accounting but of abstraction. Within generations, it is everywhere, used for rations and hymns, inventories and incantations, legal matters and literature. The standard explanation is that increasing social complexity required record keeping, and record keeping developed into writing. That explanation is reasonable. It is also incomplete. It tells us why writing would be needed, but not fully why it appears with such sophistication, or why the broader civilizational package arrives with such force. Alongside writing came mathematics. The sexagesimal system base 60 appears in Sumerian use and survives with us even now in our measurement of time and angles. They understood place value. They measured irregular fields. They calculated volumes. They tracked the heavens. Later tablets demonstrate geometrical knowledge of startling sophistication. They had law not as custom only, but as articulated reform and regulation. They had medicine with prescriptions and procedures. They had astronomy not as vague stargazing, but as organized observation. They had architecture, requiring planning, workforce management, and technical execution on a scale difficult to dismiss as accidental. The deeper question is not simply how they developed these things. The deeper question is how they themselves explained having them. Because the Sumerian texts do not present civilization as a purely human invention, again and again they describe knowledge as something received. The Sumerian king list, most famously preserved on the Weld Blundell prism, begins with the statement that after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not after kingship evolved. Not after people gradually organized themselves into political hierarchy. After kingship descended from heaven. The text presents rulership as transmission, not invention, a gift, or an imposition. Something brought from elsewhere into human society. The same pattern appears in the myths of Inanna and Enki, the divine powers or principles that structure civilization, kingship, priesthood, truth, war, sexuality, craft, social order are not discovered through trial and error by humanity. They are possessed by the gods and transferred. The Barton cylinder, fragmentary though it is gestures toward the same vision, cities established by divine decree kings, appointed through divine action order, brought in from beyond rather than slowly built up from below. None of this proves the Sumerians were right, but it proves something important. They did not think of themselves as the ultimate source of civilization. they consistently claimed inheritance, transmission, instruction. The knowledge came from the gods. The structures came from the gods. Kingship came from the gods. The city itself in its deepest order was not human innovation alone. And Eridu, the city, most often treated as the first matters here, more than almost any other. Archaeology shows a sequence of temples there, spanning from the Ubaid period onward, one structure built atop the remains of another, preserving continuity of orientation and purpose across immense stretches of time. 17 successive temples on the same site. This is not random drift. It suggests fidelity to a plan. Eridu was the cult center of Enki, the god of wisdom creation, fresh watercraft, and hidden knowledge. According to the texts, it was also one of the places where humanity itself was brought into being. The Eridu Genesis, though damaged, presents a sequence that feels less symbolic than chronological. Humans are created, cities are established, kingship is appointed. The flood comes later. It reads as unfolding history, at least in the way the text presents itself. And if we take the Sumerians at their own word, even only as an experiment in perspective, then what we call civilization did not emerge by human effort alone. It was given structure by beings they called the Anunnaki. That idea leads directly into the more radical possibility beneath the creation accounts. If the Anunnaki transmitted knowledge, organized cities, established kingship, and brought the principles of civilization into human life, then perhaps their role was not simply instructional. Perhaps it was biological as well. Perhaps the same beings who gave civilization also created the labor force needed to sustain it. And this is where the old divide opens again, the one we keep returning to because the texts keep returning to it. Are these claims theological only? Are they symbolic ways of saying that civilization feels larger than its human participants? Or are they records distorted, perhaps, but records nonetheless of events remembered as real? What caused the Sumerians to preserve this pattern with such consistency? Why this insistence that what mattered most came from elsewhere? Why this repeated refusal to describe their own beginnings as purely human? The questions are circular because the evidence is circular. It keeps leading back to the same center. Civilization descends, knowledge is transferred, humanity is created, labor is assigned. The sequence does not wander very far. And perhaps that is what makes it so unsettling. The story changes in emphasis from text to text, but not in structure, not in its essential claims. To understand whether that structure means anything beyond mythology, we have to know how the tablets were read in the first place, how this lost world became legible, and why legibility does not always mean certainty. That is where the investigation turns next. Before anyone could argue about what the tablets meant, someone had to make them speak again. For nearly 2,000 years, cuneiform lay silent. The wedge-shaped marks impressed into clay by Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians survived in astonishing quantity. But survival is not the same thing as comprehension. The signs were visible. Their meaning was gone. Entire civilizations had written their laws, their hymns, their transactions, their observations, their medical procedures, their prayers, and their histories into clay, and then time placed those records behind a wall of unreadability. The recovery of cuneiform in the 19th century remains one of scholarship's great acts of resurrection. And like so many acts of resurrection, it began with fragments, with persistence, and with the suspicion that a dead language could still be coaxed back into life. The decisive breakthrough came through multilingual inscriptions, above all the Behistun inscription in western Iran, carved on a cliff at the command of Darius I around 520 BC. The inscription appeared in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Henry Rawlinson, in one of the more improbable chapters in the history of decipherment, copied the inscription by clinging to the cliff face and working his way across it over years in the 1830s and 1840s. Old Persian being simpler and connected to better understood language, families yielded first. From there, scholars moved toward Babylonian, and from Babylonian backward into Sumerian, the older language adapted into later cuneiform traditions. By the 1850s, multiple scholars could independently translate Akkadian texts and arrive at substantially similar results. That matters. It means cuneiform was not deciphered through one idiosyncratic imagination, imposing meaning where none existed. It became legible through a converging method. Grammar sign values, lexical lists, bilingual texts, parallel inscriptions. All of it gradually opened the archive. And what an archive it was! Once readable, Mesopotamia did not emerge as a land of only temples and legends. It emerged as a civilization of extraordinary record-keeping. Tens of thousands of tablets, grain allocations, merchant letters, marriage contracts, tax receipts, legal rulings, omen texts, astronomical diaries, medical handbooks, ritual instructions, epic poetry, administrative memoranda. The range is almost overwhelming. Clay survives where other materials vanish, and because of that, Mesopotamia speaks in unusual detail. This is crucial to the Anunnaki question. The people whose creation stories we are examining are the same people who documented barley rations, field dimensions, and surgical treatments with meticulous care. Their literary imagination existed, of course. They told myths and composed hymns. But they were also unmistakably procedural thinkers. Their language was habituated to specification. Their texts often move by sequence method and recorded outcome, and yet readability does not solve everything. We can translate a word and still remain uncertain about what world of meaning that word inhabited. We can reconstruct grammar and still fail to reconstruct conceptual assumptions. This is where the problem sharpens. Take the term Anunnaki. It appears throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature. Often it is translated as something like those of princely seed or offspring of An. They are associated with the senior gods, the gods who decree fate, the divine assembly above ordinary humanity and often above the lesser gods as well. In many texts, they are contrasted with the Igigi, the subordinate laboring gods. That hierarchy matters because in the Atrahasis account, the Igigi are the ones who rebel and humanity is created to replace them. Mainstream scholarship reads the Anunnaki straightforwardly as mythological deities within a polytheistic religious system. Nothing in the text explicitly prevents that reading. The texts call them gods. They possess powers humans do not. They belong to a divine order. To read them as anything else is to depart from the default scholarly frame. But at the same time, the texts describe them in strangely physical ways. They eat, they drink, they become tired, they become angry, they fear consequences, they debate, they use tools, they follow procedures. Nintu does not simply speak humanity into existence. She needs materials. Enki does not merely will a species into being. He proposes a method. The gods act with bodies, with needs, with limitations, with steps. This may simply be anthropomorphism. Ancient people imagined gods in familiar terms because that is how humans imagine everything larger than themselves. That is the standard answer, and again, it is not unreasonable. But it does not make the physicality disappear. The text still describes process, it still describes sequence, it still describes action in a register difficult to reduce entirely to metaphor. Translation intensifies this tension rather than resolving it. Cuneiform signs can carry multiple readings. Sumerian, a language isolate, contains concepts that do not map cleanly onto English. Akkadian is more transparent, but even there words live inside ancient assumptions we can only partially recover. When a text says a god's blood is mixed with clay to create humanity, we can translate the words. The question is what those words were trying to describe. Mainstream interpretation takes blood as divine essence, the sacred principle of life intelligence or personhood. Clay represents earthly matter. Combined, the two symbolize the dual nature of humanity, mortal earth infused with something higher. This is elegant. It fits comparative mythology. It explains why humans are between animals and gods. But the texts do not always sound elegant. They sound practical. A god is chosen. He is killed. His blood is obtained. It is mixed with clay. The mixture is shaped. A developmental process follows. Humans result. The causality is firm. The sequence is procedural. The language often resembles technical instruction more than mystical exaltation. This is why some alternative readers have proposed that blood might represent what ancient people understood as inherited essence, what we might now call genetic material. If Bronze Age scribes were trying to preserve memory of biological manipulation far beyond their conceptual vocabulary, what words would they use? Blood would be an obvious choice. Blood carried lineage, life, and identity. Clay would stand for earthly, biological matter. Mixing would mean combination. Shaping would mean design. Gestation would remain gestation because that part requires no abstraction at all. It is stillbirth. This interpretation is speculative. It is not mainstream. But notice what gives it its persistence. Not proof, not physical evidence. It persists because the texts themselves refuse to stay comfortably symbolic. They say too much, they say it too methodically, and they repeat it too consistently. There is another point that complicates the myth-only reading: the purpose clause. The texts repeatedly state why humans were made: to bear the load of the gods, to dig canals, to till soil, to perform labor. This is not incidental decoration, it is the motive. And that motive is startlingly pragmatic. We are not told humanity was created mainly for worship, or out of divine loneliness, or as the center of cosmic beauty. We are told humanity was made because work needed doing. If this is myth, it is a severe myth. If it is theology, it is an unusually practical theology. If it is social ideology, it is brutally honest ideology. And if it is memory, then it is memory of an event too strange for our historical frameworks to welcome. That is the interpretive problem. The tablets can be read. The translations are reliable within normal scholarly limits. The real uncertainty lies not in the signs, but in the decision we make after the signs have spoken. Are we reading mythology through the proper lens or history through the wrong one? The answer cannot be forced yet. But the question becomes even harder to avoid once we return to the text at the center of the matter, the labor crisis itself. the rebellion of the lesser gods, and the decision that followed. That is where the narrative becomes most concrete and most difficult to dismiss. Tablet B, M78941 begins not with a mystery in the abstract, but with a problem as plain as exhaustion. The gods are tired. Not all of them. The text distinguishes between ranks. The Igigi, the lesser gods, have been assigned the heavy work of the world. They have dug canals. They have dredged rivers. They have excavated earth. They have carried baskets of soil. The work is relentless. It continues for 40 years. That number alone is worth lingering over. 40 years is not a symbolic instant. It is duration. It is the length of a burden measured in time. It suggests not a flash of divine drama, but a prolonged condition, a labor regime that has become intolerable. Then the Igigi stop. The text describes their rebellion in concrete stages. They gather at night. They complain. They decide together. They burn their tools. They march to the gate of Enlil. They surround his dwelling. A steward reports the disturbance. Enlil bolts the door. The language here is startlingly close to social crisis, almost close to strike action, close to revolt, close to collective refusal. Not cosmic metaphor, but laborers refusing labor. This matters because the response is equally practical. Enlil calls the senior gods. Anu arrives. Enki arrives. Nintu is summoned. A council forms. And the question before the assembly is not moral in the modern sense. It is administrative. If the Igigi will not work, who will work in their place? Enlil is angered. He wants to know who incited rebellion. He views the refusal as insubordination. Yet the assembly cannot escape the underlying fact: the labor itself is crushing. Even in the text, the complaint is acknowledged. The burden is real. Punishment alone will not solve the problem. Someone must still dredge the rivers. Someone must still dig the canals. Someone must still bear the baskets. The infrastructure of the world, or at least of civilization, still depends on labor. At this point, Enki proposes the solution that has echoed through every later discussion of the Anunnaki. A new being will be made, a being specifically designed to assume the toil that the gods reject. Nintu, the mother goddess, will create it. But not from nothing, not by command alone. Materials are needed. Procedure is needed. Assistance is needed. A god must be slaughtered. The text specifies this. The blood of that god must be collected. Clay must be obtained from the earth, in some versions from the Abzu, the deep freshwater domain associated with Enki. Blood and clay must be mixed. Nintu, assisted by Enki, will shape the mixture. The process will be repeated. Multiple beings will be produced. These beings will then assume the workload of the gods. If one were trying to write ideology alone, one could say far less. One could simply say that the gods made humans to serve them. Many traditions stop there. But atrahasis does not stop there. It lingers on the method. It insists on steps. It lays out a process with a kind of almost technical calm. The verb for creation carries the sense of shaping, building, fashioning. The resulting being is not a vague spiritual emanation. It is a constructed worker. And then another detail appears. 7 males and 7 females. Not one first man, not one first woman, but a small population, a founding set. Again, the text could have been simpler if symbolism alone were its goal. Yet it is not simpler. It is numerically specific. It introduces sexual differentiation immediately. It suggests not singular origin, but reproducible origin, a beginning already structured for continuity. There is a gestation period too, 10 months. Not instant animation, not divine speech, bringing immediate life, but development over time. Birth goddesses attend. Nintu acts in a role close to midwife as much as creator. The first humans do not simply appear, they are brought forth. And when they are brought forth, the text is blunt about their purpose. They are assigned work. The canals still need digging. The rivers still need dredging. The fields still need tending. The building still needs doing. Humanity enters the story already occupationally defined. We do not first exist and then discover work. We exist in order to work. Mainstream scholarship explains this as theological justification for Mesopotamian social structure. Most humans labored for temple and palace institutions. Therefore, a myth emerged saying humans were made for labor, which rendered the social order natural, sacred, inevitable. This is a serious interpretation. It should not be dismissed. Ancient societies often did precisely this, embedding power structures into sacred narrative. But the interpretation does not absorb every detail. Why 40 years? Why the burning of tools? Why the formal council? Why the procedural emphasis on blood clay shaping gestation multiplicity? Why does the text contain so much more than the ideology strictly requires? Why, if the point is merely to explain servitude, does the narrative sound so much like a report? The tasks themselves matter too. Canal digging in Mesopotamia was not symbolic labor. It was civilization's foundation. Irrigation determined survival. To control water was to control life, crops' food order. The region required constant management of rivers and channels. Dredging and digging were not incidental occupations. They were civilizational necessities. If someone were creating a labor force to sustain life in southern Mesopotamia, canal work would be central. Mining appears in related versions and interpretations as well, along with building. Again, these are not vague hardships. They are specific categories of work tied to material civilization. Digging, extracting, carrying, constructing. The text never loses sight of function. Humanity is a solution to a labor shortage. It is difficult to think of a more pragmatic creation story. If we follow the alternative reading, even just as a thought experiment, the implications become uncomfortable very quickly. Humanity would not be the result of undirected natural development alone. Our intelligence coordination and physical endurance would be features selected because they served a need. We would be a designed response to a practical problem. Our capacities would match our purpose because our purpose shaped our creation. That sounds impossible. But the text itself sounds impossible too, and yet it says what it says. It says there was a problem. It says a council met. It says a procedure followed. It says humans resulted. It says the workload was transferred. The narrative structure is causal, sequential, almost administrative. This happened then this, and therefore humanity exists. Perhaps that is still myth. Perhaps it is simply a myth, unlike others, in its severity and its procedural texture. But if it is myth, it is myth. With an unusual memory of work, an unusual memory of design, and an unusual refusal to flatter the species. It explains. And once the labor problem has been posed, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly did the gods discuss in that council? What was the formula they agreed upon? And why does the text describe it in a manner so close to instruction? That is where we have to go next, deeper into the conference of the gods and the creation formula itself. After the rebellion of the Igigi, the narrative does not rush forward. It slows, it convenes, it listens. The senior gods gather, and what follows is one of the strangest things in all of ancient creation literature, a divine meeting that reads like deliberation under constraints. Enlil is shaken by the uprising at his gate. He is also enraged. The laborers have marched on authority itself. In many mythologies, a god confronted in this way would simply crush the revolt. But that is not what happens here. Enlil does not immediately annihilate the rebels. Instead, he summons the other senior deities. Anu comes, Enki comes, Nintu is called. The divine assembly forms. This is governance, not thunderbolt. Procedure, not spontaneous omnipotence. The text preserves their responses in a way that matters. Enlil wants accountability. Who stirred the rebellion? Who made the Igigi stop working? But the council cannot remain at the level of outrage because the practical issue persists. The work itself has become intolerable. 40 years of continuous labor has broken the lesser gods. Whether they are punished or not, the canals still remain, the rivers still silt, the earth still waits to be moved. So Enki speaks. In text after text, when there is a problem that requires not force, but method, Enki is the one who answers. He is the solver, the thinker, the one associated with wisdom, craft, hidden knowledge, and the deep freshwater realm beneath the earth. He proposes that a new being be made, a being not divine in the full sense and not merely earthly in the ordinary sense either. Something mixed, something designed, something that will bear the load. The method is then laid out with unsettling specificity. A god must be selected and slaughtered. In some versions, the god is associated with intelligence, reason, or understanding. That detail matters because it implies the chosen being is not random. The blood of this god, carrying more than fluid and pointing toward essence, identity, perhaps even inherited capacity, is to be gathered. Clay is then brought often from the Abzu, the domain of Enki, the deep place, the source beneath the world. Blood and clay are mixed. The mother goddess shapes the mixture. Birth goddesses attend. A developmental period follows. Then the first humans are born. It is difficult to overstate how procedural this sounds, not because modern science is hidden plainly inside it. We should resist easy anachronism. But because the text insists on method when method is not required for myth. If its only purpose were to say that gods created humans, it could say so in a sentence. Instead, it itemizes. Why is a god's blood needed? Why not create humanity from clay alone? Why must the selected god possess intelligence? Why is the clay from a specific source? Why a gestation period? Why 7 males and 7 females? Why a founding group rather than a single pair? Why are there assistants? Why does this all feel less like miracle and more like process? Mainstream interpretation sees the symbolism immediately. Blood represents divine spark. Clay represents mortal substance. Humanity becomes a blend of earth, and sacred essence. The 10-month gestation mirrors observed pregnancy. The use of birth goddesses ritualizes creation. The sequence reflects the Mesopotamian need to explain why humans are mortal, yet intelligent, earthly, yet distinct. Again, this is coherent. Again, it is serious. But notice what the interpretation must do. It must translate the procedural detail back into symbolic meaning, because the literal surface is too concrete. It must say blood means essence, clay means earth, gestation means analogy, shaping means image, and labor means theology. Perhaps that is exactly right. But it is also possible that the symbolic reading grows out of discomfort with how matter-of-fact the text actually is. There is another related composition, Enki and Ninmah, that intensifies the problem. In that text, creation appears almost as craft and competition. Multiple beings are formed. Some are defective. One cannot bend properly. Another cannot control bodily functions. Another cannot speak. Another cannot reproduce. These are not moral flaws. They are functional defects. The text then frames the gods as trying to find uses for the malformed beings, as though creation involves trial variation and imperfect outcomes. That is deeply odd if we are dealing with omnipotent creation through pure divine will. Why would there be errors? Why would gods need prototypes? Why would creation be iterative? If, however, the text preserves some memory, however mythologized, of an experimental process, then the defects make disturbing sense. A procedure is being attempted. Not every result works. Some outcomes are viable, but limited. Others are failures. Adjustments are required before a successful model is achieved. That is not the language of effortless supernatural fiat. It is the language of engineering. And then there is the number 14. 7 males, 7 females. One could read that as symbolism, completeness, sacred order. Ancient numbers often carry theological resonance. But the number also works as a practical beginning, a small founding population capable of reproduction. The texts do not make that argument explicitly, of course. They simply present the fact. Yet the fact remains: the first humans are produced not as an isolated individual, but as an immediately reproductive group. Even the gestation period lingers strangely. 10 months, a delay, a time of development. Something happens between the shaping and the birth. The beings are not finished in the moment of construction. They must grow. That detail is difficult to dismiss because it changes the entire tone of the creation account. It is not a god molding statues and breathing life into them instantly. It is a process that resembles biological development. Alternative interpretations have long seized on these details. Blood becomes genetic contribution. Clay becomes earthly biological substrate. The chosen god's intelligence becomes selected traits. Gestation becomes actual gestation. Birth goddesses become surrogates or attendants. The resulting humans become hybrids of divine and earthly materials engineered for function. This reading remains speculative, unorthodox, and unsupported by direct archaeological proof. It must be said plainly. But it persists because it maps with unsettling ease onto the structure of the text. It does not need to force the procedure into the narrative. The procedure is already there. What it does is offer a modern analogy for why such procedure would be necessary. And perhaps that is why the Sumerian material is so difficult to settle. The mainstream reading is strong, but the alternative reading is not born from fantasy alone. It is born from the text's own strange resistance to simplification. The text keeps sounding like a record of method. It keeps sounding like someone wanted the steps remembered. A god is chosen. Blood is taken. Clay is collected. The materials are combined. The mixture is shaped. A developmental period follows. Humans are born. Labor is assigned. The gods are relieved. It is hard to hear that sequence only once. The mind returns to it. The questions return to it. Was this metaphor crafted with extraordinary precision or memory preserved in the only language available? Was it theology all along, or theology wrapped around something older and more concrete? The narrative does not answer. It only continues. And to continue, we have to follow the figure at the center of the process, the one who knows the method, the one the texts repeatedly place closest to both creation and knowledge, Enki. In the Sumerian world, Enki occupies a peculiar position. He is not always the supreme god. That place belongs elsewhere to Anu, in the highest order, or to Enlil, in power, over the world of wind and command. But when a problem demands knowledge, when a crisis demands craft, when creation demands method, the texts turn again and again to Enki. He is the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of craft, of intelligence, of hidden things. His dwelling is the Abzu, the subterranean fresh water deep beneath the earth source reservoir foundation. In Mesopotamian imagination, the Abzu is not merely a location. It is a domain of stored power and stored knowledge, a place from which life rises and from which solutions emerge. If the texts are read theologically, Enki is the wise god whose understanding penetrates what others cannot grasp. If they are read as distorted memory, he begins to look almost like a technical specialist, the one who understands how things are made. This is not a modern invention imposed from the outside. It is the pattern of the texts themselves. In Atrahasis, it is Enki who proposes the creation of humanity. In Enki and Ninmah, it is Enki whose wisdom determines whether defective creations can be given function. In the Eridu Genesis, Enki stands near the center of the establishment of humans and cities. In healing texts and incantations, Enki is associated with knowledge of the body of remedies of practical understanding. Again and again, he is the one who knows how. That phrase matters, knows how, because there is a difference between power and procedure. Power can command. Procedure must understand. And Enki is repeatedly presented not simply as powerful, but as understanding processes the others do not fully understand. In the creation narrative, Nantu cannot proceed alone. The procedure requires Enki's guidance. The materials must be correct. The method must be correct. The result depends not only on divine intention, but on knowledge. This gives the creation scenes an unusual texture. Gods in these texts are not always omnipotent in the abstract. They are capable, but they are also constrained by method. They need ingredients. They need sequence. They need skill. They deliberate, adjust, and sometimes fail. That is one of the reasons the material resists easy comparison with later, more absolute models of deity. The Abzu itself becomes important here. Why must the clay come from there, or be associated with that realm? The theological answer is that the Abzu represents the deep source of life and fertility. Enki's domain, the pure generative matrix beneath the world. The procedural answer, if one follows the alternative reading, is stranger. The earthly substrate required for creation belongs to Enki, because life on Earth, biological material itself, lies under his expertise. Either way, the texts insist that the earthly component of humanity is not generic soil from nowhere. It is selected matter connected to a knowledgeable domain. Then there is Enki and Ninmah, perhaps one of the most revealing texts in the entire discussion. After humanity has been created, the gods feast. They drink, they become boastful. Ninmah praises her shaping power. Enki counters that without his wisdom, her shaping would be meaningless. And then they begin a contest of creation. This is extraordinary. Why? Because the scene assumes creation is a craft at which one can be more or less skillful. Ninmah produces beings with defects. Enki assigns them roles. Then Enki produces a being so malformed that Ninmah cannot find any use for it. The exchange is often read as theological reflection on disability fate and divine wisdom, and that reading has value. But the structure of the narrative still points toward experimentation. Not all creations are successful. Some are partial. Some are compromised. Some are unusable. If creation is only symbolic, why dramatize it as competitive craftsmanship? Why make mistakes possible? Why have one deity better at diagnosis than the other? The alternative reading sees in this scene not simply theology, but memory of trial and error. Early attempts at forming a viable human being resulted in defects. Some forms lived, but were limited. Some failed functionally. Only through repeated adjustment did a stable human model emerge. The text itself does not use the language of experiment because it cannot, but it does preserve the logic of experiment, attempt, flaw, evaluation, correction. Enki's role in all of this is not that of a distant creator speaking worlds into being. It is the role of designer-technician, biological problem solver. Even the later tradition remembers him that way. Medical incantations invoke him as source of healing knowledge. Crafts are linked to him. Cleverness is linked to him. Hidden structures are linked to him. He knows what is inside things and how they function. That association carries into the Adapa tradition as well. Adapa, the wise human created or specially favored by Enki, is given extraordinary understanding. The texts explicitly state that Enki perfected wide intelligence for him, but did not give him immortality. That is selective design language. Not in modern terminology, no, but in the logic of capacity assignment, yes. A trait is granted, another is withheld. This is not generic blessing, it is controlled distribution. If Enki can do that in one case, why not in others? If one human can be configured differently, why assume all humans were made in only one undifferentiated act? The texts do not flatten creation into a single mystical event. They repeatedly imply modulation variation capability and controlled limits. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is why the Enki material remains so provocative. It suggests that the gods, or the beings called gods, did not merely create, they engineered. Or at least the texts remember them as if they did. None of this compels belief. It does not overcome the lack of direct physical evidence, but it sharpens the interpretive problem. If we read Enki only as symbolic wisdom, then all the procedural detail becomes literary ornament. If we read Enki as memory of technical intelligence, then the ornament becomes methodology disguised by theology. The tension remains, and it deepens when we consider what Enki and Ninmah implies about failure. Because if the creation of humanity involved unsuccessful versions before a successful one, then the Sumerian texts are preserving something even stranger than deliberate design. They are preserving iterative design. Prototype after prototype, defect after defect, until a workable model appears. That possibility leads directly into the next question, and perhaps the most unsettling one of all: were there failed human designs before us? If the Mesopotamian creation texts described perfect divine will, we would expect perfection from the beginning. The gods would speak, the world would answer, the intended form would appear without complication. That is what omnipotence looks like in narrative. But the Sumerian and Akkadian material does not always give us that. Instead, it gives us failure, and failure changes everything. In Enki and Ninmah, the beings created during the contest are not symbols of sin or punishment. They are beings with specific functional defects. One cannot bend his hands toward his body, another cannot control his urine, another struggles to walk, another cannot retain semen, another cannot give birth, another cannot speak or hear. The text moves through bodily systems one by one, as though the problem in each case is not moral but biological. Something in the design has gone wrong. That is a strange thing to preserve in a creation narrative. It is stranger still because the text does not treat these outcomes as impossible. It treats them as expected enough to be discussed, evaluated, and repurposed. Enki looks at each defective being and tries to assign a use. Not because the being is ideal, but because it exists and now must be integrated into the world. The logic is pragmatic. The creation has been made. It does not fully work. What can be done with it? That sounds less like theology in the grand style and more like troubleshooting. Then Enki produces a being so weak, so malformed, that Ninmah cannot assign any function at all. She protests. The being is useless. Every part of him is in distress. Here, the logic of the narrative reaches its sharpest point. Creation can fail not only partially, but completely. The right combination can produce a viable, if limited, organism. The wrong combination can produce an organism too compromised to function at all. If one follows the conventional reading, the text becomes a meditation on disability, fate, human suffering, and the deeper wisdom of the gods. That reading deserves respect. It may well be correct, but the text also reads as if it remembers a process in which not all created beings were successful. A process of repeated attempts, a process where the line between working and not working mattered. This is where some readers connect the narrative to the broader question of early human forms. Paleoanthropology documents multiple hominid species existing across long spans of time. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, anatomically modern humans. Standard science explains this through branching descent and natural selection. That framework is powerful and evidence-based. But the Sumerian alternative, taken strictly on its own terms, would imagine these variants differently as stages prototypes or parallel attempts in the development of a functional, laboring human. It is an audacious reading, and it must remain marked as speculative. The fossils do not come labeled with mythic intention. But the attraction of the comparison is obvious. The texts describe multiple attempts, some more successful than others. The evolutionary record shows multiple human-like forms, some viable for long periods, others disappearing. One framework says branching natural history. The other says iterative design remembered as myth. The evidence does not force the second, but the text structure makes the second conceivable enough to remain difficult to ignore. Consider what the successful human in the texts must be able to do. Work in coordinated groups, understand commands, perform physical labor, reproduce, endure, learn, build, dig, carry, speak, obey. A failed version might lack one of these. A nearly successful version might possess some, but not others. In that light, Enki and Ninmah reads almost like a record of capacities being adjusted one bodily system at a time. And then there is Adapa. Among the earliest or most notable humans in Mesopotamian tradition, Adapa stands apart as an anomaly. He is wise beyond ordinary men. The text says Enki perfected broad understanding for him. But immortality, crucially, was not given. That omission is not incidental. It is deliberate. Wisdom granted. Immortality withheld. A trait profile selected. The story unfolds with precision. Adapa serves Enki in Eridu. He breaks the wing of the south wind after it overturns his boat. He is summoned before Anu. Enki warns him not to accept food or drink in heaven, telling him it will be the food of death. But the food offered is actually the bread and water of life. Adapa refuses and loses the chance at immortality. The narrative traditionally explains why even the wisest human remains mortal. Yet beneath that theological meaning sits another pattern. A human can be made exceptionally intelligent, but still deliberately denied another trait. Again, selective design language. If Adapa represents a specially enhanced human, then the text preserves the idea that the makers of humanity could modulate traits. Intelligence could be raised. Longevity could be withheld. Mortality itself could be controlled. The gods or beings called gods maintain hierarchy not simply by power, but by design boundaries. Humans may be improved, but only so far. That is a chilling thought, and the text lingers on it without ever naming it directly. Adapa is close to the gods in understanding, but not too close. He is brilliant, but still finite. He remains beneath the line that separates creator from creation. If he crossed that line, the distinction would collapse. So, the line is preserved biologically. The same pattern might explain why some figures in ancient tradition appear semi-exceptional. The Apkallu, the sages, the antediluvian figures with improbable abilities or knowledge. Are these simply literary exaltations? Or are they memories of special cases, enhanced humans, selected intermediaries between divine knowledge and ordinary humanity? The texts do not settle the matter. They only repeat the pattern. Variation exists. Some humans are baseline laborers. Some are wiser. Some fail. Some flourish. Creation is not flat. And this is what makes the notion of prototype failures so haunting. The texts seem to remember that humanity, as we now know it, may not have been the first attempt. Before the successful model, there were malformed versions, partial versions, perhaps experimental versions. The engineering, if engineering, it took time. It took correction. It took iteration. Or in mainstream terms, the mythology imagines human imperfection through divine contest. and uses embodied defect to think about fate, social function, and limitation. That remains the scholarly reading. Yet even there, the procedural texture does not go away. The text still talks like design. The more one listens, the more one hears the same thing from different angles. Humanity was made. Humanity was adjusted. Humanity was assigned purpose. Some forms did not work. Some forms did. Traits were selected. Limits were imposed. Intelligence could be enhanced. Mortality could be retained. The hierarchy was built in. And if the hierarchy was built in, then the next question becomes painfully direct. Built in for what? For which purpose? The tablets do not hesitate. They return again and again to the same answer. We were made for work. So the next step is to look at that work itself, not abstractly, but concretely. Canal digging, mining, building the labor categories. The texts repeat until they sound less like metaphor and more like specification. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts are almost severe in their honesty about why humanity exists. They do not decorate the purpose much. They do not cloak it in grandeur more than necessary. They say humans were created so the gods would no longer have to perform hard labor themselves. That is the center of the claim. And when they describe the labor, they are not vague. We were made to dig, to carry, to build, to work the earth. Begin with canal digging, because in Mesopotamia, canal digging was not just one kind of labor among many. It was the labor beneath civilization itself. Southern Mesopotamia depended on irrigation. Without canals, the land could not support the agricultural abundance on which city life relied. Rivers had to be directed. Sediment had to be cleared. Earth had to be moved in immense quantities. Banks had to be maintained. Systems had to be extended and repaired over and over again. A canal was not a poetic object. It was an engineered lifeline, and it existed only because labor reshaped the land. Administrative texts from Mesopotamia show exactly how serious this labor was. Work gangs, supervisors' quotas, ration distributions, beer and barley allotments, all of it appears in the records. These were societies that knew what organized labor looked like because they ran on it. So, when the creation narratives say the Agigi spent years digging canals and carrying baskets of earth before refusing to continue the task is not symbolic. It is the kind of labor Mesopotamian civilization understood at its deepest practical level. Then there is mining. The texts and later interpretations vary in emphasis, but the broad point remains. Mesopotamia lacked many of the raw materials it needed. Metals had to come from elsewhere. Copper, tin, silver, gold, stone all required extraction, exchange, transport. Some versions and interpretations of the Anunnaki story place mining closer to the center of humanity's assigned function. The texts themselves are more cautious and varied, but they do repeatedly frame human purpose as physical extraction and environmental transformation. Whether that means canal mud field earth or mineral resources, the pattern is the same. We take what lies in the ground and bring it up for use. Then building. The ziggurats, temples, city walls, platforms, and monumental complexes of Mesopotamia did not rise by abstraction. They rose because human beings made millions of bricks, dried them, carried them, stacked them, sealed them, repaired them, and did it again. The great structures of Sumer and its successors are crystallized labor. They are visible proof that organized human work can transform the environment according to a plan. The texts describe humans as bearers of baskets, and builders of what the gods design. The division is clear: design above, execution below. That division is important because it remains the same in every retelling. The gods decide. Humans implement. The gods decree. Humans carry. The gods are freed from labor. Humans assume it. This is not secondary detail. It is the reason the creation project exists. Mainstream scholarship explains this as social ideology. Human beings in Mesopotamian society, especially common laborers, worked for temple and palace systems. Therefore, myth arose saying labor was humanity's divinely appointed role. The myth naturalized hierarchy and made institutional extraction appear cosmically grounded. Again, this is plausible. Again, it should not be dismissed lightly. But there are still difficulties. The labor ideology appears early, so early that it may not simply be a later rationalization of already mature palace economies. It may be foundational rather than retrospective. In other words, the Sumerians may not have first built labor systems and then invented a myth to justify them. They may have organized life around labor because they believed labor was the fundamental reason humanity existed. That does not make the myth historically true. But it does complicate the claim that the story is only post hoc ideology. There is also the peculiar bluntness of the narrative. Most cultures prefer origin stories that elevate humanity, divine love, cosmic significance, sacred destiny, special status. All of that is common. The Mesopotamian account is colder. You exist because work had to be done. The gods were tired. A labor force was needed. So one was made. Why invent that if it were not deeply believed? Why create a creation story so unflattering to the creature being explained? Unless the point was not flattery, but memory. Unless the purpose of the story was not to praise human dignity, but to explain human function. And in fairness, one could answer that ancient social systems often are blunt. An elite civilization built on labor extraction might not need to flatter workers. It might need only to stabilize obedience. That is true. But even then, the creation narrative's precision remains striking. It does not just say humans serve. It says they were made to bear the exact workload that had broken other beings. If one follows the alternative reading, this becomes almost chillingly logical. Design a labor force, and what do you need? Intelligence enough to understand instruction. Language enough for coordination. Dexterity enough for tool use. Physical stamina enough for repetitive effort. Social cohesion enough for group projects. Reproductive capacity sufficient for self-sustaining population growth. Mortality enough to prevent long-term challenge, but longevity enough to acquire skill. In other words, you need something remarkably like human beings. The text does not say this in modern design vocabulary, of course. It says it in the old way. We were made to dig canals, to till fields, to carry baskets, to build what had to be built. Yet the implication remains. Our capacities match our assigned tasks with eerie precision. And this is one of the reasons the question returns no matter how often one tries to close it. What if the practical fit is not accidental? What if humanity's behavioral and social features, our ability to organize, toil plan, coordinate, endure, and transform landscapes, are not simply outcomes of evolutionary adaptation, but the very capacity selected because they served a civilizational labor function? That is not a mainstream claim. It runs against standard evolutionary history. but it is the sort of thought the tablets provoke because they are so relentlessly focused on use. Humans are useful. Humans are functional. Humans were made because someone needed function from them. We can recoil from that because it diminishes us. Or perhaps because it reduces what we call civilization to a prolonged extension of assigned work. Yet when we look at history, what do we find? We build, we extract, we dredge, we dig, we carry, we shape environments according to plans. Even in the modern world, with all our complexity, we still spend most of life doing versions of the same thing. Labor organized toward material transformation. The tablets noticed that, or claimed to explain it, or remembered why it was so. The distinction remains unsettled, and there is one more strand that has to be examined before judgment is possible. If the beings called the Anunnaki created humanity, and if human beings were made with capacities precisely suited to their work, then those creators would understand the human body intimately. Which brings us to a different archive within Mesopotamia, one that at first seems unrelated, but may not be at all the medical texts. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites, some of the most revealing are neither epics nor hymns, but medical texts. They do not speak in the register of myth. They speak in symptoms, ingredients, procedures, diagnoses, and treatments. And they matter here because they show us what Mesopotamian practical knowledge looked like when written down. The oldest known medical handbook from Nippur, dating to around 2000 BC, already presents medicine not as scattered folk custom, but as system. Prescriptions are laid out with ingredients, preparation methods, and application instructions. Plant material, mineral material, animal products, proportions, sequences. One treatment is ground mixed with beer and applied as a paste. Another is compounded into an ointment. The form is procedural. The expectation is repeatability. A written medicine implies trained practitioners, not just oral improvisation. Later collections, especially those associated with the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, develop this even further. Diagnostic texts proceed by fixed structure if the patient shows this sign. And this sign, then this is the condition, and this is the prognosis, and this is the treatment. The observational rigor is striking. Symptoms are differentiated. Body parts are tracked. Disease is categorized. Surgical procedures are referenced. Pharmacological caution appears in the understanding that a substance may heal in one dose and harm in another. This is not primitive guesswork. It is early organized medicine. Mainstream history explains such medicine through long empirical accumulation. People observed which substances helped which conditions. Over generations, effective remedies were retained, ineffective ones discarded, and eventually the knowledge was recorded and systematized. That is a sensible explanation. It is the explanation scholarship generally accepts, and for good reason. Human beings learn through repetition, pattern recognition, and intergenerational transmission. But the Mesopotamian material introduces another layer. The texts themselves repeatedly attribute medical knowledge to the gods. Gula, or Ninisina, is the goddess of healing. Enki, too, is linked to restorative knowledge. Human physicians are often framed as servants or transmitters of divine understanding. Healing knowledge is not always portrayed as discovered from below. It is revealed from above. Again, this can be read theologically. Ancient medicine often places itself under divine patronage. The doctor acts under the protection of a healing deity. The source is sacred because healing concerns life and death. No revision of history is needed, yet the insistence on taught knowledge becomes interesting if placed beside the creation narratives. If the Anunnaki created humanity, then they would in principle understand the body they created more completely than the humans living inside it. They would know which materials affected which systems. They would know anatomy. They would know function and malfunction. They would know the design. The human physician in that framework would not be the original discoverer of medicine, but the apprentice custodian of knowledge handed down from those who built the organism. This possibility is speculative, yes, but it aligns uncannily with how the texts present the relationship. The physician does not invent treatment out of nothing. He applies procedures already known, already fixed, already transmitted. Enki and the healing goddesses hold the deeper understanding. Human practitioners carry it forward. Certain features of Mesopotamian medicine become especially suggestive under this lens. The use of dangerous substances with controlled dosage, the confidence implied in difficult procedures, the relatively early systematization. None of this proves instruction from advanced beings. It may all be the result of empirical refinement, but the texts themselves imagine it otherwise. They imagine medicine as taught knowledge, not merely accumulated accident, and that matters because it reinforces a pattern already seen elsewhere. Kingship descends. Civilizational principles are transferred. Human creation is instructed by divine method. Medicine, too, is given. The flow is consistently downward from the Anunnaki or the gods to humanity. Culture, law, healing order, all are transmitted. The human role is implementation, preservation, adaptation, not origin. This is one reason the Adapa material and the Apkallu traditions continue to haunt interpretation. The sages are remembered as bringers of knowledge, not inventors in the modern sense. They teach, they reveal designs, they disclose hidden order. If certain humans received enhanced understanding from Enki, as the texts say Adapa did, then perhaps the earliest technical and medical knowledge entered society through selected intermediaries. Again, that is the alternative reading. Again, it is not academic consensus, but it tracks with the textual pattern. There is also a tonal reason the medical texts matter. They remind us how Mesopotamian scribes wrote when preserving procedures that were meant to be used. The style is ordered concrete, functional. Not all medical writing is beautiful, but much of it is precise. And when the creation texts are set beside that procedural world, their language becomes more difficult to dismiss as mere ornament. They too move by ordered steps. They too care about materials. They too preserve sequence. Perhaps that is coincidence. Perhaps procedure is simply part of Mesopotamian literary habit, even in myth. But perhaps not. Because if one civilization writes crop counts, legal contracts, astronomical records, prescriptions, and creation accounts, all within overlapping habits of documentation, then we should at least notice when one genre begins to borrow the tone of another. The creation of humanity in these texts is narrated with a practical calm that feels oddly adjacent to recipe method and protocol. This does not make it scientifically true. It simply makes it difficult to classify too quickly. Still, classification matters. We cannot drift into wonder without returning to scholarship, because scholarship is where these texts live in modern interpretation. The academic view is clear disciplined and overwhelmingly against a literal reading of genetic engineering or historical Anunnaki intervention. Before proceeding further, that view has to be represented fairly. And it has to be represented fully, because if the alternative reading is to be considered at all, it must be considered against the strongest version of the mainstream case, not a caricature of it. That is where the investigation turns now. Mainstream scholarship does not interpret the Sumerian and Akkadian creation narratives as records of literal genetic engineering by advanced beings. It interprets them as mythology in the technical and scholarly sense of the term, sacred narrative, cosmological narrative, theological explanation, social justification, cultural memory shaped by religious imagination. This is not a trivial dismissal. It is a long-developed framework grounded in linguistics archaeology, comparative religion, and the broader scientific understanding of human origins. The major scholars of Mesopotamian religion read the text this way. Samuel Noah Kramer treated the Sumerian creation material as literature reflecting ancient belief, not as documentary history. Thorkild Jacobson interpreted the gods as personified powers of the world and the myths as responses to the Mesopotamian experience of nature, danger, fertility, authority, and dependence. W.G. Lambert, who worked extensively on Atrahasis, and Enuma Elish treated these texts as theological compositions addressing questions of why humans exist, why labor is hard, and why mortality defines the species. John Botero emphasized the practical and transactional dimensions of Mesopotamian religion. Humans served the gods because the cosmos was ordered that way. Jeremy Black and Anthony Green described the Anunnaki as divine beings within a polytheistic system, not historical entities hidden behind myth. The consensus is broad because the evidence supporting the mythological reading is substantial. The texts call the Anunnaki gods. They place them in divine genealogies. They give them immortality and supernatural power. They embed them in ritual and cult practice. The creation of humanity from clay and divine blood has obvious symbolic dimensions. Clay links humans to earth mortality and materiality. Blood links humans to divine essence, intelligence, sacred capacity. The result is a species poised between matter and spirit toil and thought, mortality, and order. This is theologically rich. It does not require literal biological engineering to function as explanation. The labor emphasis also fits ancient social reality. Mesopotamian societies depended on organized work for temples, irrigation systems, agricultural production, and monumental construction. A myth saying humans were created for labor would naturally reinforce social hierarchy and institutional authority. It would render the burdens of life meaningful, or at least inevitable. Suffering and toil would not be random. They would belong to the species' ordained role. Then there is science. Modern genetics, paleoanthropology, and archaeology place human origins within a long evolutionary history. Anatomically modern humans emerge gradually from earlier hominid populations. Brain size, tool use, social complexity, and symbolic behavior all have deep roots. There is no accepted physical evidence for intervention by a non-human advanced species. No confirmed Anunnaki artifacts. No biological signature accepted by science as proof of ancient external engineering. No archaeological layer demonstrating a technologically superior creator civilization. And that matters. It matters enormously. Because texts alone, no matter how old or internally consistent, do not overturn an established scientific framework. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Clay tablets are evidence of belief, of narrative, of memory, of worldview. They are not by themselves sufficient evidence that the events they describe occurred literally. This is why scholars reject the literal reading. Not because they have failed to read the texts, not because they are afraid of mystery, but because the literal reading demands more than the evidence presently gives. It asks us to abandon or radically revise what we know about evolution and early civilization on the basis of textual claims embedded in a religious world. And scholars are right to resist that leap. At the same time, scholarship has learned caution from its own history. There have been cases where mythology preserved historical cores that were once dismissed. Troy was treated for a time as literary imagination before archaeology confirmed a city and a destruction sequence that changed the discussion. The Hittites, once shadowy in textual references, became undeniable when their archives were excavated. Flood traditions across Mesopotamia, once treated as purely mythical, turned out to resonate with real flood events in the region. None of this proves that every myth conceals history, but it proves that myth and memory are not always easily separable, and that is the opening through which the alternative reading speaks. It does not say scholarship has no grounds. It says scholarship may be categorizing too quickly because the available frameworks favor myth when literal reading would cause too much disruption. It points out unusual features in the texts, their procedural detail, their consistency across time, their emphasis on labor rather than devotion, their portrayal of iterative creation and defective outcomes, their attribution of practical knowledge to divine instruction, and their origin within a civilization obsessed with documentation. These features do not prove the alternative. They do, however, explain why the alternative continues to persist. The texts do not feel entirely like free-floating sacred imagination. They feel tethered to steps. They feel as though they are trying to preserve a method or the memory of one. Still, that feeling cannot replace evidence. And so we arrive at the actual boundary. The mainstream view is the defensible academic position because it fits the broader body of data. The alternative view is interpretively provocative because it takes the text with unusual literal seriousness. One privileges scientific coherence. The other privileges textual surface and procedural consistency. Both begin from the same tablets. Both read the same signs. They diverge at the moment of classification. That divergence matters because it explains why this discussion never settles. The mainstream account can explain the texts without changing science. The alternative account can explain some textual details the mainstream tends to spiritualize or absorb. Each leaves something unsatisfied. The mainstream may feel too quick to call procedure symbolism. The alternative may feel too quick to call symbolism memory. Neither side fully escapes difficulty, which returns us once more to the tablets themselves. If interpretation remains contested, then pattern becomes important. Not a single text, not a single fragment, but the recurrence of the same structure across cities, centuries, languages, and scribal traditions. When that pattern is mapped out, the question grows sharper again. Because the repetition is real, the narrative persists, the formula persists, the purpose persists, the sequence persists. And it is in that persistence, more than in any one dramatic line, that the deepest challenge lies. When one tablet says something extraordinary, the responsible response is caution. When many tablets from different places and periods say substantially the same extraordinary thing, the responsible response is still caution, but a different kind of caution. Not less skeptical, but more attentive. Because repetition matters. The creation narrative associated with the Anunnaki does not survive as a single, isolated curiosity. It appears in the Eridu Genesis, in the Atrahasis tradition, in Enki and Ninmah in KAR4, in Enuma Elish in the Adapa material, and within the larger assumptions embedded in the Sumerian king list and related literary traditions. These texts differ in emphasis. They come from different cities. They were copied in different centuries. Some are in Sumerian, some in Akkadian. Some are fragmentary, some more complete. Yet the core pattern does not dissolve. There is a labor crisis among divine beings or within the divine order. A council is held. A decision is made to create humanity. Divine material, usually blood, is combined with earthly material, usually clay. A shaping process follows. A developmental or birth process follows. Humans emerge, humans are assigned labor, the gods are relieved. That sequence remains astonishingly stable. The Eridu Genesis connects human creation to the establishment of kingship and cities under divine supervision. The Barton cylinder points towards similar themes of divine ordering and human placement. Atrahasis gives the fullest labor rebellion account and the most explicit procedural detail. Enki and Ninmah preserves the atmosphere of craft competition and defective results. KAR 4 condenses the formula into stark summary. A god is slain, blood is used, humanity is made service, is imposed, the gods are freed. Enuma Elish, though framed in Babylonian royal theology and the supremacy of Marduk, still preserves the same essential formula through the blood of Kingu. Adapa gives us selective human enhancement and selective withholding. The king list begins with kingship descending from heaven and does not sharply distinguish mythic prehistory from historical sequence. These are not identical texts, but neither are they random cousins. They orbit a common center. Mainstream scholarship explains this stability by reference to Mesopotamian scribal conservatism. And that explanation has force. Scribes copied authoritative texts with care. Educational traditions preserved old compositions. Cultural prestige attached to old Sumerian materials, even in later Akkadian and Babylonian contexts. A myth could remain stable simply because it was culturally central and carefully transmitted. That is true. But here again, the nature of what is preserved matters. Mesopotamian scribes were conservative, not only with myths, but with useful knowledge, lexical lists, mathematical tables, legal precedents, ritual procedures, omen series, medical recipes. Accuracy mattered where replication mattered. The more a text functioned as a reference or authoritative record, the more carefully it was preserved. So when the creation formula is preserved with this much continuity, one has to ask what kind of truth it represented to those who copied it. Was it purely theological truth too sacred to alter? Or was it remembered as factual truth too foundational to distort? The texts themselves do not announce the answer, but they do preserve the procedure with unusual fidelity. And this is where the comparison with mythology elsewhere becomes interesting. Myths often vary widely over time. Greek creation traditions shift from Hesiod to Orphic versions to later Roman reworkings. Egyptian creation takes multiple forms depending on cult center. In many traditions, broad themes remain while details drift considerably. The Mesopotamian creation formula, however, remains narrow and practical. Blood, clay, shaping, birth, labor, relief of the gods. The same machinery keeps turning. That does not prove history. But it does make the narrative feel less flexible than one might expect from ordinary mythic elaboration. There is also the matter of what the texts do not move toward. They do not increasingly spiritualize human purpose. They do not drift away from labor into more elevated claims. They do not make humanity more glorious over time. Even in later iterations, we remain workers. The point remains function. That stability is unusual. The species does not become more flattering in retelling. It remains a burden-bearing solution. And perhaps that is part of what gives the whole tradition its peculiar weight. It never becomes entirely symbolic in the way later readers might wish. It keeps insisting on the same blunt center. Humanity exists because someone had work that needed doing. The alternative reading takes this pattern very seriously. If multiple independent textual traditions preserve the same procedure, then perhaps they are preserving memory, not only theology. If they maintain the same formula because the formula mattered, then perhaps accuracy itself was part of the tradition. If Mesopotamian scribes treated the origin narrative as foundational truth in a strong sense, then perhaps they believed it recorded events, not simply metaphysical meaning. The mainstream reading takes the same pattern seriously in another way. The consistency shows how important the myth was for Mesopotamian religion and society. It became authoritative because it explained human labor, divine hierarchy, and the structure of life in a way the civilization found deeply persuasive. Repetition reflects cultural power, not literal fact. The procedure remains stable because ritual imagination can also be conservative. Again, the divide is not over the existence of the pattern. The divide is over what the pattern means. But the pattern is there. That much is not controversial. And that is why the climate-controlled rooms in London, Philadelphia, Oxford, and elsewhere feel in this discussion almost like waiting rooms of interpretation. The tablets are cataloged, published, photographed, translated, available. They do not hide. They simply refuse to settle their own meaning. They sit in silence while readers argue over category. Mythology, memory, theology, distorted history, social ideology, procedural tradition. All of these labels hover over the same clay. The more one studies the pattern, the more one feels the question change. At first, it sounds like a sensational claim, did the Anunnaki create humanity? But eventually, the subtler question takes over. Why did the people who first built cities preserve this narrative in this way? Why this structure? Why this insistence on labor? Why this procedural calm? Why this continuity? The tablets do not answer directly. They only keep saying the same thing. Humans were made. The makers were the Anunnaki. Blood and clay were involved. Work was the purpose. The gods were relieved. The world proceeded from there. Whether that is myth or memory remains unresolved. But the unresolved question is itself part of the evidence now. It has endured because the texts do not let it go. And so after all the tablets and all the interpretations, we arrive where these investigations often end, not with certainty, but with the question still alive, still asking itself through clay, still waiting for each listener to decide how close they are willing to stand to it. After all the fragments, all the translations, all the comparisons, all the care taken to remain fair to the scholarship and faithful to the texts, the central difficulty remains exactly where it was at the beginning. The tablets exist. They say what they say. They claim that humanity was created by beings called the Anunnaki. They claim that the reason for our creation was labor. They claim that this was done through a procedure involving divine and earthly material blood and clay-shaped and brought through a developmental process into living human beings. They claim this occurred in response to a practical crisis. They claim it in multiple texts across long stretches of time with remarkable continuity. Mainstream scholarship rejects the literal reading of these claims, and it does so for responsible reasons. There is no confirmed archaeological evidence of advanced ancient creators using biological engineering. There are no recovered laboratories, no preserved devices, no remains of the Anunnaki as historical beings, no accepted genetic signature proving external design. Human evolutionary history, as understood by modern science, unfolds through deep time and natural processes, not sudden creation by non-human intelligence. To read the tablets literally requires stepping outside the evidential discipline that governs responsible historical and scientific interpretation. That is true. It must remain true in any serious discussion. And yet the tablets themselves do not read like fantasy, trying to be fantasy. They read like memory, trying to become language. Or at least they can be heard that way. Their tone is procedural. Their details are stubborn. Their purpose is practical. Their repetitions are too consistent to feel casual. Their creators belong to a civilization that wrote everything down, that measured and counted and recorded with relentless care. This does not make the claims true, but it makes them difficult to shrug away as mere ornamental theology. There is a reason the question lingers. It lingers because the texts sit in an uncomfortable zone between categories. They are too mythic to be accepted as straightforward history. They are too procedural to feel entirely like free symbolic invention. They describe impossible things in a tone more suited to documentation than to ecstasy. They claim our purpose is labor with a bluntness most origin stories avoid. They portray design limitation iteration, selective traits, and functional assignment. If one were trying to preserve memory of biological engineering using Bronze Age language, the result might not look very different. But that remains a possibility, not a conclusion. And perhaps that is the most honest place to remain. Not in certainty, but in contact with the question. Because look at what the question really asks. It does not only ask whether gods existed, it asks whether the oldest literate civilization on Earth might have been preserving, however imperfectly, an account of human origins more deliberate than we are comfortable imagining. It asks whether mythology can sometimes be a damaged vessel carrying memory. It asks whether all our distinctions, myth versus history, symbol versus event theology versus procedure, are clean enough for the oldest text to fit inside them. Maybe they are. Maybe the safe answer is also the right one. Maybe the Sumerians created an origin myth of unparalleled detail because their society was built on labor and hierarchy, and because their imagination clothed those realities in divine narrative. That is plausible. It is scholarly. It is methodologically sound. If that is where one lands, one stands with consensus and with caution. But perhaps the reason the myth became so detailed, so stable, and so procedural is that it was never experienced by its transmitters as only myth. Perhaps they preserved it because they believed it referred to something that had actually happened long before their own age at the boundary where civilization began. and memory became sacred. Perhaps the gods of the tablets were not gods in the later abstract sense, but beings remembered through the only categories ancient language could offer. Perhaps the words blood, clay, shaping, and birth are not the language of fantasy, but the nearest possible approximation of a process the scribes did not fully understand and yet felt compelled to record. Or perhaps not. That uncertainty is not failure. It is the honest condition of the evidence. We stand now where the tablets leave us, in the space between what can be confirmed and what cannot be dismissed entirely. The archives remain. In London, in Oxford, in Philadelphia, in collections across the world, clay rests in darkness and controlled air, impressed with wedges hardened by fire carrying messages across thousands of years. Those messages have been read. They are not hidden. And still, they continue to ask more than they answer. What are we? Were we made, as the texts insist, for a purpose tied to labor, to work to the transformation of the world through organized effort? If so, then much of human history looks different. The cities we built, the canals we dug, the stones, we raised the fields, we worked, the systems we organized, all of it becomes not merely culture but function, not merely adaptation but design expressed over millennia. If not, then the Sumerians produced one of the most severe, coherent, and strangely technical origin mythologies ever written, and preserved it with almost documentary reverence. Either possibility is extraordinary, and perhaps that is why the question does not fade at the end of inquiry. It follows, it returns, it loops back, as the tablets themselves loop back to labor, to design, to purpose, to the unresolved line between earth and something above earth. We still build, we still dig, we still extract, we still organize ourselves into systems of work. We still spend our lives converting thought into structure and effort into world. The texts say we were made for exactly that. Whether that is cosmic coincidence or a clue is the question they leave in our hands. Not solved, not closed, not safely filed away, only handed forward. And so when the room is quiet, when the screen darkens, when the mind returns to first things, the oldest claim remains waiting in the same patient form it has always used. Not stone, not metal, clay, silent, durable, ordinary clay, carrying an extraordinary proposition. We were created, we were shaped, we were given purpose. The evidence does not force belief. The scholarship does not permit certainty. The tablets do not permit easy dismissal. So the mystery remains where it began, and where perhaps it has always wanted to remain, in that narrow and difficult place where history may be mythologized memory, where mythology may be damaged history, and where humanity is left listening to its oldest texts. Ask a question it still cannot fully answer. What if the Sumerians meant exactly what they wrote? If you want, I can continue with a second pass that tightens the rhythm further and makes each part land even more like spoken narration for voiceover performance.